The government's war on so-called misinformation wages on. At this point, it's like a permanent trash fire that just won't go out. The latest development is that the government has now introduced legislation into Parliament. It did so on the 12th of September of 2024, after having received feedback on a prior draft version of the legislation. The new version is slightly less terrible than the prior draft version, but as I'll talk about here, it is still rather bad, and we can all hope that it doesn't ultimately pass Parliament, but you never know. Now, to give a sense of how unpopular this legislation is, let's look at some of the feedback on the prior draft, because it wasn't good, and hopefully the government's own regulator, ACMA, has published this feedback on its website. The feedback is overwhelmingly negative. It's also telling that the regulator itself could not even find, or did not want to find, puff statements to support the bill. It's not even clear that the regulator actually wants the power that the government is trying to give it. The regulator, to my mind, seems to regard this legislation as a little bit draconian and doesn't really want it, hence why all of the feedback published was so overwhelmingly negative. Now, to give you an idea about how the legislation would have worked, in essence, it would have deputized social media companies with going around and policing so-called misinformation. The definition of misinformation was incredibly broad. Furthermore, social media companies would not need to police representations of communications from the government or news outlets or academics or things along those lines. The feedback, therefore, was rather negative because people rightly saw that the government could then go and publish whatever it wanted without being fact-checked or without being called out for misinformation or without being suppressed for misleading the population itself. People saw through the hypocrisy. Now, ACMA, therefore, has published some of these comments in relation to this. They categorized the comments into various themes. The most pertinent to my mind was censorship. Here are some choice comments, and I've only selected some of them, but you can check them out for yourself, and these are representative. One of the comments stated, "I do not support the proposed censorship of online digital freedom of speech, which is being disguised as a way to control misinformation and disinformation." This comment rightly sees that the so-called misinformation and disinformation prohibitions are simply a censorship regime, the word misinformation becoming a weasel word. The next comment, "No to censorship. My voice and my opinion is everything to me. No government should get to decide what is misinformation and what is not." I say no, 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 no. While it is true that as long as humans exist, the misinformation will exist on all levels, on all platforms, censorship is not the answer. The government is not and should not be in control of what is the truth. No censorship, please, leads us down a very dark place. When censored, hate groups and similar go underground, where they aren't so easy to find. When they speak in public, we can all realize how silly they really are. Censorship has no place in a free society. Or alternatively, I oppose any form of censorship in Australia, so I don't support this legislation. A rather short, pithy comment about the whole situation. And then finally, I am seriously concerned that providing ACMA with new powers to combat online misinformation and disinformation could lead in time to excessive censorship and serve the purposes of a selected group with specific targets and aims. It is notable that ACMA even published that comment itself because it was telling ACMA that it shouldn't actually have any more powers. There were also comments about the government being exempted from the prohibitions. So as a reminder, under this draft legislation, the government would have been exempted from the policing of so-called misinformation. Social media companies would need to go down and suppress so-called misinformation from private individuals, but not from the government if it were to post it on things like YouTube or TikTok or whatever the case might be. Again here, the feedback was very negative. For example, the exclusion of government-authorized content from the censorship regime is hypocritical and inconsistent. It establishes an asymmetry, resulting in one rule for the government and another for the Australian people in terms of what they can say. And the bill is hypocritical in that it exempts government-authorized content from the censorship process to be required of digital service providers. Governments of all stripes have a long history of misinformation, obfuscation, and even prevarication on critical issues. This double standard permits the government of the day to distribute ideological views without guaranteeing those of a different opinion the right of expression or reply. And finally, One very concerning aspect of this bill is that content authorized by the government would be exempt. It is incredible that a government would be willing to make a law and exempt itself from that law. The bill proposes one rule for the government and a different rule for everyone else. Now, in relation to that final comment, it's actually interesting, because there are a great many rules and laws that exempt the government. Often the government simply isn't subject to the rules that it itself passes. This is not an exception here, but it is something that is rather troubling, because it would let the government go out and mislead the population. So with this in mind, it is actually a little bit interesting that the government persisted with this legislation. I couldn't really find any positive comments about the draft regulation. Law professors, through the general population, disliked it. Now, the government's new legislation, which I've read in part but I haven't done a deep dive, is slightly less trash, but it is still bad. The main changes to the draft are the definition of what is misinformation. It's not an improvement, but it is a change. And how they phrase the government's exemption from the misinformation prohibition. It is now more surreptitious. So, in relation to the definition of misinformation, the new bill defines misinformation as content that, quote, contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading, or deceptive. Now, at a high level, that sounds all great. However, let's have a think about this. Misleading or deceptive? Who determines what is misleading or deceptive? Is it the government? Is it the regulator? In reality, it's going to be social media companies trying to infer what the regulator or the government would say. The social media companies thinking to themselves, well, gee, if we let this content get out there, is the regulator or the government then going to complain that there's misinformation, and are we going to be penalized? Now, this definition is a little bit nonsense, and it isn't really an improvement over the prior definition. The prior definition, in fact, was actually a little bit more onerous. It said that the content must contain information that is false, misleading, or deceptive. I would have thought that requiring it to be false, misleading, or deceptive is actually a higher hurdle to jump over than just reasonably verifiable. I would have thought you would actually need to prove that it is false, misleading, or deceptive for it to be classified as misinformation. The government, however, appears to disagree. Now let's think on this for a second. This is broad and value-laden and can encompass almost anything. Just think about all the times that Anthony Albanese has falsely claimed that the No campaign was misleading or spreading misinformation during the referendum. People, of course, saw through this, but it didn't stop him from claiming otherwise. Think of the controversy over lockdowns. Think of the controversy over the origin of an unknown virus of unspecified origin that is not advertiser-friendly. The definition of all of this is utterly absurd. It appears that they've just cast a very wide net. Furthermore, since social media companies are tasked with policing the so-called misinformation, there would be no practical way of even resisting false claims that content is misleading. How are you going to appeal this? How will you even know if you are being suppressed? It creates a rather large issue. The next change, of course, is how the government is exempted from the prohibitions. As I've talked about before, the government was previously specifically exempted from the prohibitions on misinformation and from these regulations and from the policing. This, of course, triggered a rather large backlash. So how did the government respond? Well, the government appears to have responded by being a little bit more clandestine in exempting itself. Previously, it was explicitly stated, now it is buried in other sections. For example, in Section 81, it states that legislation is not to influence how state or territory governments conduct their functions. That is, their propagandizing, which is a function they often engage in, would seemingly keep going on. It would seem that social media companies would not then go and scrutinize representations from state or territory governments because communicating appears to be part of one of their functions. Furthermore, in other areas in the legislation, the minister can make directions for social media companies to have regard to or not have regard to various factors, one of which is the author of that information. So what this means is that after legislation passes, the minister can then go and say, well, when considering what is misinformation, social media companies would have regard to the author of that information, and if the author is the government, well then that would mean they should assume the information is not misleading and should not go and scrutinize it or take it down. That is, the government can surreptitiously exempt itself from these regulations. At least before, it was out in the open that the government was trying to exempt itself from the censorship regime. Here it is more buried, and here it will have slightly less clear cut-through for people trying to resist the legislation. Now, at the moment, it appears this legislation and this bill does not have broad support. Clearly, it is going to pass the House of Representatives because the ALP effectively has control of it. In the Senate, it's not totally clear exactly what will happen. The coalition is presumably going to resist it. However, the coalition does not have control of the Senate. The Greens also presumably are going to resist it because they're in a bit of a conflict with the government over things like the CFMEU and things such as all of the protests that have been going on in Melbourne that have turned a little bit ugly. Furthermore, the crossbench presumably is not in favour of such regulation because they might fear they'll be perhaps forced out via government propaganda. So it might not actually pass the Senate, but it remains to be seen. But in any case, this legislation is truly terrible. We can all hope that it fails. But let me know if you think that it's an improvement in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.